Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi. Hang on, I just have to check on something.
Yep.
Right, sorry. So, Fabienne, did you want to start by showing something?
Yes, I mean, I could do the little computational notebook introduction.
Okay. That's cool.
Should I start now?
Yeah, I think we're, yeah, I think most of us are here. Are you here, Bob? I think Fabienne will be primarily showing this to you.
It's primarily for anybody interested.
Yeah, this is true. But I think Bob was the newest person to this, so. Yeah. Are you there, Bob, or breakfast, or? Well, we see Jim is here. Well, Jim is connecting.
I'm here.
Okay, no, Bob.
No, he said he was here.
He did? I didn't hear that for some reason.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, here with the camera off. That's fine. That's totally fine. Okay, Fabienne, please.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, a little anecdote first, but it could be interesting in the future, either for notebooks or for the content of those meetings. I just noticed that like I had some performance issue for the last meeting because I updated my operating system and somehow everything works better except Zoom, which somehow is like huge performance hit. It still works perfectly, but the fan starts and it shouldn't. Anyway, point is now I'm using Zoom over the web. I don't think I tried before because I thought, oh, it's probably some features missing, but so far you can hear me all right. And the funny thing is, it's good that you confirm because it would have been silly if I were to start to advertise for it and it doesn't work. So I'll share my screen this way, I can also show you. It means that, for example, I can, using the console, I can query whatever is happening on the screen. And then, for example, I can play with the logs. I don't have to save to a file and do whatever to it. And I mention it because I'll give a little example of computational notebooks based on or using data from Zoom meeting. And I don't want to sound too circular, but I think it makes it more interesting for us if we can play with tools based on the data that is precious to us, like one of those meetings. So yeah, that could be something interesting to somehow bring some of the data from Zoom, maybe even some audio, to something web-based, or to analyze or adapt however we want, without having to like think about the Zoom plugin or whatever access. Would probably be way trickier, if ever possible.
Yeah. Well, one thing that it immediately renders possible, hello me, is the being able to identify the speakers at the times as well, because either just the CSS class is being toggled. Because I wrote something using the web get user media API in order to identify those color changes on the boxes. But actually, just being able to tell those CSS transitions will give it to you with zero ambiguity, and not having to use one web page to sort of scrutinize another one. So that's really exciting, really interesting to think about.
Yeah, and we can add buttons and whatnot. So yeah, that was, it's a little bit off topic, but somehow might be at some point more useful than Computational Notebooks for the meeting. Anyway, so I'll give a bit more context. Last meeting we discussed about what meant the future of text for each and every one of us. And at some point I was stumbling a bit because I talk a lot about VR, and I think it's definitely the most exciting interface. But in terms of the future of text itself, I find that computational notebooks will change the way we read or consume content or build content or teach. Potentially with VR, but doesn't have to. And some people are not familiar with computational notebooks, so I did a very short introduction, and I'm going to show it again and also invite you, if you want to tinker with it, to try it live. So I'll share my screen again. So let me know if you can see it. And I can't see the screen, so you need to use your voice, please.
It's working.
Thank you. So that thing already is a computational notebook. It looks like a web page because it is a web page.
We can hear you.
I know.
Oh, okay, fine.
We can't hear you.
And what makes it a little bit different from a normal web page, if we just scroll through, already we can have a hint that when we move from one paragraph to another, it highlights on the side, but then you can move things around. So you can grab a paragraph, move it around. And what's interesting is you can have those little widgets, and it changes everything related to it. So if I change here,
you went a little too fast for me.
Yep.
When you said you could move things around. I didn't see what, your cursor is moving all over the place, but I didn't see what you could move around.
So here, So I'll put it. Let's say I take this paragraph. I'll zoom out. So all the paragraphs, there are cells, just like in Excel, for example, and I can click on it and then move it. So the first cell became the second cell. Does it make sense?
Yes, now. Mm-hmm.
I'll do it again, or I'll do it something more visual. Let's say I take this one.
It does make sense. Yes, the answer was yes, to me at least.
So, and why do I mention this? Well, first, because I think it's pretty powerful, the same way that some of us think, for example, when you build a presentation and then on the side you have the thumbnails, and then the way you are going to tell the story or convince people, you're going to reorder the cells or the pages in order to make your point more, easier to understand, basically. So here you have your text. You have your widgets like this number that you can change. So of course you can change it. You can click around, or you can change with a keyboard, but you can move it around. What's a little bit, let's say, magical is when you see me clicking on it, you see a little bar appear on the side here, and that means it's been updated. So again, just like Excel, if you were to use Excel, or a spreadsheet, let's say, if you change a cell, every cell related to it is going to be updated, right? So it's basically reactive. It reacts to the input, and if you change an input, it changes it. What you can see also is it does it, let's say, efficiently. If I change this value, it changes everything related to it, but the text on top doesn't change, right? So it has all those key properties, but I'm going to backtrack a bit here to say why. What's the point of having all this? And basically the idea is to have, again, like you would have in a blog post or a research article, an argument. So you need to explain, what's your point, where you come from, whatever, the key concepts. But when the problem is challenging enough, whatever you're trying to explain is too complex to understand just by reading, then you poke at it. You poke at it, you can play with the system, let's say, or the object of the study. And that's an example of playing at it. Like if I were to tell people, oh, I need to change the timing of the chat logs of our meetings freely, that might not be very obvious. Once you move that bar along and then you see the time change, in my opinion at least, it becomes a lot more obvious. So the goal of those computational notebooks are to entangle the two. Yeah,
I did not see where the time it went too fast. I didn't see where the time changed.
so you see the widget there, and here, here you have the text.
Yeah.
So those are if I actually click on it, it's going to send us to the YouTube page of the meeting and adjust the right time. I'm going to mute this, because that's what we discussed last week. It would be good if, it's loading, so you'll have to trust me on this, but anyway.
Okay.
And what's interesting is here, it's at 0. There is no offset. Let's say we started the meeting at whatever, 9 a.m. But if I click on it, I say, for example, we were 6 minutes late. And then the timing here says 1:32. And if I click here, it says 1:21. So the text changes based on the value. Does it make sense?
Yes, sort of. Yeah, but right. Go ahead.
So the goal of this is not to make like a user interface. So I'll show something a bit more, hopefully, interesting. This one I showed because that's the one we discussed last week. But one I've done a bit more than a year ago, is to explain what spatial audio is. So if you're not familiar with spatial audio, I'll just make a summary. But it's when you're in VR, for example, or it doesn't have to be VR, but if you enter a room, people are far away, you don't hear them well. You get closer to them, you hear them better. That doesn't work with Zoom. We all hear each other at exactly the same volume. And if we can't have, let's say, a one-by-one chat, it's if two of you are bored by what I say and you want to chat with someone else, you can do it in private with the typing around, but you can't do it with voice. Huh? So I made a little explorable. So that's a computational notebook, but focusing on explaining a topic. So I tried to give some visuals, but unlike, let's say, something you would just read again, here you can play with it. So if I move the slider, that's going to represent the distance to the speaker. So if I'm further away, that represents me listening, and the speaker, then the volume is not as loud. If I get closer, louder, I can hear more, better, rather understand better, etc., etc. So the idea is that you intertwine the text with the code. So all that, you can display it with some JavaScript code, but it doesn't really matter the language. And this is some text, clearly, as you can see. But the idea is to intertwine the story or the explanation with not just a visualization, but a representation of the content. So how are you going to manipulate it to understand it better?
Mhm.
And the idea here, I visualize sound, but you have, hundreds of them. There are some like this, one that Brendel showed last time on climate change. Again, the idea is that you're trying to convey a rather complex topic, not just like, what are you going to buy as grocery tomorrow, but rather, here it's climate change. And you can not just read the text, but that's exactly what Brendel showed last time. When you move at this, it's going to impact so that you can make your own, basically, opinion on it. Hopefully, if it's done properly, it's going to help to convey an argument, but you're not just reading, let's say, a fixed argument or a set of paper. So this one that was quite famous, let's say, was the parable of the polygons. That was, I don't remember, 5 or 10 years ago. Explaining a bit how behavior changed in a group. You can think of gerrymandering and plenty of other topics. And you don't read, let's say, a ton of text. You start playing with the content. So you intertwine the argument or the text or the story with interactive pieces. This one can be edited through GitHub. You can download the code and do it again, but you can't directly modify it here. Observable is a platform to do computational notebook. Another one that's quite famous is Jupyter, because it's more for data science, like Python. And I'll show a bit some of the notebooks. Well, this one is not particularly interesting, but let's say this one. And again, you intertwine what's the goal, what you're doing here, the code on how to do it, the visualization, and then you can modify it on the spot so that you can get a better understanding of the topic at hand. Okay. So little things I wrote down. In my opinion, some of the key concept is that you intertwine the code and the text. So it's not like literate programming where the comments are going to be as descriptive as possible, but rather it's you don't have to be a programmer. You can just go through. You can even just read it. You don't even have to interact with it. If that's good enough for you, you can just read things, but you can change it. If you want to modify code, you can just open it up, either text or anything you want. And the whole idea is like it's active learning. You're not just thinking you're ingesting content without actually getting it, but you break it, you fix it, you make it do something new, you change actually the argument of the author, and you're like, well, actually he's wrong or they're wrong. Instead, it shows something else. So I think it's, when you start to read a PDF about a topic, you can challenge it, you can annotate it on the side, on the, however you want, but it's really rare that you can dynamically change either the equation or the data set or whatever you want. Here you can, and it's actually encouraged or invited. You can start from an existing notebook. You don't have to start from a blank page, and you can embed at runtime. So something I just tried before. So it means you can have your cells, and here the introduction is part of some slides, and then I can use that directly in a presentation. And then I can vote or do whatever other things I would do in a presentation. So it can also be another way to present. And this, just to give you also a bit of, to develop a bit more, it means people who would watch your presentation can also tinker with that. Anybody with those slides can play with it. Can be very simple like this. Can be an equation with a graph, can be anything basically you want to program or you need to program for your demonstration. So yeah, you can embed them. And what it also means, because it's not obvious, is since anybody can run it in your presentation, they have the whole environment with them. It doesn't run on your machine and then you send the result. It's that right now because I show you. But if I were to give you this link, which I guess I'll do to make it a bit more obvious. I'll put there in the chat. So if you open that link now, you're going to see the presentation. And it should be on the same slide as I am right now. And when I switch slide, it switches slides for you. So here you can imagine reading the text. And when I'm on the slide that has part of a computational notebook, then you can play with it. And you're not going to see what I'm doing on my slide on your slide, because you can imagine your own little sandbox. And the goal again with active learning is that the person who is going to try to learn or get the information you're trying to convey is going to rediscover whatever you're doing. So by doing this, you give the person like a little sandbox that they can play with. And of course, you can intertwine, like I said, with whatever other tools you need for your presentation, like a poll to see does it make sense, etc. And then get the result with everybody who voted. Voilà, that's yet another way to use Computational Notebook. It doesn't have to be a top-down page that people visit. You can embed them in your slide or your presentation. And you can import from other notebooks. So for example, I did not define that widget. Somebody did it. And I reused their work, basically. Just like you would import code, you can also import text. You can import both. You can embed them. So yeah, quite a few things. So yeah,
very quick one. Having the link you just showed. So I now open the page, as I see, I open the page that you're on. If you change page, do I then follow, or does it just get me to the page you were on when I opened it? I mean, there's no judgment in that. I'm just asking so I understand.
Right now, it should bring you to the page I'm showing.
Yeah, but if you then change page, will my browser follow that, or it'll stay on the one I'm on?
It should.
Okay.
I say should because there might be a bug. I just tried with two windows side by side. I'll demonstrate just in case it doesn't work like this. So I have, let's imagine I'm the person presenting on the left. So I use my keyboard, and then on the right, I'll put a smaller window. In here, I'm the person viewing the slide or the content. And as you can see, here I have a value of 6 as the presenter. but me as the viewer, then I change my value. So again, it's as if the person, because it embeds the code, the text, and the runtime, has their little sandbox that they can play with. And then again, everybody does that in their corner or in the free space, and then you can aggregate how people behave or understand through things like a poll and do that. But that's, let's say that's on top of Computational Notebook. The idea is to say each of those cells can be imported to reuse what others did, but also, let's say, quote unquote, exported or embedded in any form of content. That's why I wanted to show this in slides, is because it doesn't have to have this vertical form, let's say. It can be really any shape, whatever interactivity. Yeah, I think that was most of it.
Thank you very much. Any further questions or comments?
Oh, yeah, Mark.
Yeah, just quickly, one of the things I was thinking about in this, because funny enough, it's come up in a number of things I'm involved in, is the way to which this changes the way we think about sort of writing in terms of, writing for the edification of others. Because in a sense, I guess you could have written just a textual piece before you started putting the more dynamic elements into the page. But I suspect that's not necessarily the most efficient way of doing it, which makes me think then, so what skill set? I mean, because we're a fairly even this small group here probably are fairly atypical in that regard. What sort of skill set we really need? If we sort of take our person, maybe he's just left secondary school, they probably know their way around maybe Microsoft Office at best. And I'm wondering, so what sort of extra things people will need to pick up to do this? And it's not a loaded question or a judgment. I'm just genuinely thinking how we'll need to think and adjust.
So I didn't write hundreds or thousands of these because it's new to me too. Like I didn't, I think like most people, let's say if you do either writing or programming, it's A4 or it's a landscape screen and you start from an empty page or a source code and you go with that. So it's really a different way to think. It's really, and I think that's the most valuable part is the way you work through, you come back and you move things around. I think it's really empowering. So I say all this with a bit of like a warning that, yeah, it's still new to me or challenging to me, but I would tend to think the workshop mindset is better. Instead of thinking, oh, I print a document and I give them to people, it's more like it's a asynchronous workshop, let's say. Instead of thinking, okay, we book 1 hour together and we do it together, it's like, no, I prepared this and I prepared a workshop that people can run whenever they want to. And then you can still, what I failed to do, to be honest, and I think, for example, Brett Victor or others have done much better, is to tell a story at the same time. I'm still, I believe, too technical. I think to make it a bit more either personal or as a story, for most people is much better. I have a friend who does, well, actually, the one I mentioned on Twitter who is working on the pedagogy of mathematics through VR. I'd like to invite her to present, and she thinks a lot more with just stick figures, and somehow we still relate more to stick figure to just like an abstract he or them or whatever, and she does that a lot, and I think that works quite well. So if you can indeed start with a story or start with something more poignant people can relate to and intertwine, and it works even for technical topics. But yeah, it again, different way to work that.
Yeah, I would say I was answering Mark's question. A lot of scientists, particularly people in things like the biology, like I've got a friend who's a neuroscientist, and he works in Python, and all of the scientific visualization and data analysis packages that he makes use of are in Python. And so having a PyCharm notebook means that he can kind of arrange and array the investigations in sequence in a way that people typically do when they're writing code to understand things. But rather than having to save versions of it, it can be kind of streamed down a page. And in that same way, I sometimes do this, sometimes don't. When I write in JavaScript, I follow a similar process where I have sort of versions, variations, and copies, and I can kind of work with one and move it along, or I can take copies and sort of smear them down a document, essentially, in the various states that they have. And that's especially valuable when it's relating to data in particular, because you're transforming something, and it's useful to pursue that sequence in order to understand all of the steps that one's undertaken with it. There's another really great example that I, just as Fabian was talking, I realized is sort of in Family is a website called The Book of Shaders. Shaders are the graphical sort of programs that people use to render certain things in certain forms. And that document itself is a sequence of shaders that you're encouraged to sort of nudge and poke and change numbers on, and actually also click and drag. And so it's a sort of an observable by stealth.
I can see why this enables you to change numbers. It wasn't clear to me how this would be some sort of advantage when I'm writing in Word, for example, just ordinary text. What is there any advantage to it?
Yeah, if it's solely words, like I wouldn't use it for poetry, for example.
I'm not talking about. I usually never talking about poetry. I'm talking about the kind of communication of difficult ideas.
Yeah. So typically, if it's difficult because the topic is complex, like if you have a lot of moving parts, and there can be some sort of simulation, like if that part does this action to that other part, etc., etc. When you're very familiar with the topic, it's fine. When you're not, again, being able to poke at the system, say, okay, if this would happen, this would do that. That's, in my opinion, that's when it's the most valuable. When you can put that system, again, even if it's in symbols, like a box or a set of boxes, and they have some action one against the other, then that's valuable.
In other words, what you're saying, it facilitates comparison of diagrams?
Yeah, could be diagram. I think the most, how do you say? The less symbolic it is, I mean, depend entirely on the audience. I shouldn't say this, but in general, the less symbolic and the more practical, the easier it is to understand. So if you talk about a forest, you can of course symbolize it, let's say, with a circle, and the size of the area in hectare can grow based on that. But you can also like draw little trees, again, closer to a simulation where you draw every single little tree. And if you say, oh, if we have more tree, then it's going to have this or that impact, either economically or in terms of carbon capture. And then you let people move the slider so that they reach the conclusion you want. So yeah, representing the system this way.
Well, when you shifted to move the slider, I did not understand how that would change things in the text or in the little tree symbols.
So each of the cells, each of the part of the notebook can optionally be linked one to another. So if you put on the top of the, let me just do it. Let me share again. I'll share my screen, and you let me know.
I think that the main strength is that whenever we supply data in a discursive context, we're making a choice about what is going to be the most representative data. And an observable or computational notebook has the ability to present a range of data rather than a single exemplar, so that you can see the landscape, the sort of the performance of a certain tendency as a consequence of the sort of the patterns that you're observing. So when you say there are 10 trees, then that maybe tells somebody about the landscape of those things. Or you may need to say, conversely, if there are 100 trees, that one of the benefits that comes out of a notebook is that people have the ability to see that entire sort of landscape themselves.
Yeah, that clarifies somewhat to some degree. Although I haven't seen it, and having to be able to see it, of course, is what.
So I put it here. It's very basic, obviously, but you have your text, the title. You have another bit of text. I'll zoom as much as I can, and here I change not 10 trees, but a lot more, and the text changes like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in the text, because I said instead of 10 trees or 10,000 trees, I just put the number of trees. And whenever I change here, I change there. But if below it, if I were to have, let's say a pie chart, number of tree versus number of house versus whatever, the pie chart again will also be adapted. And if that pie chart would be linked to another, like a fake little city, let's say, a visualization of it, it would also update it. So again, you let people play with this data, and then everything else comes from it. And it doesn't have to be just representative, let's say, of the result directly. You can have some condition. Let's say if the number of 3 is above a threshold, let's say 33%, then everybody dies, whatever. So it doesn't have to be like unconditional. You can change based again on, like I'm again using the simulation example. You simulate a complex system and you let people play with it.
About a year back, I recall reading a piece discussing computational notebooks. I think it was in a Python context. And the complaint was that they were playing with notebook entries out of linear order. Yep. And that was posing issues with side effects and how the different examples were sharing context between them. Is that something that's been resolved within the last year, or is that still a problem?
Yes and no. It hasn't been resolved in the sense that that's the nature of the beast. Like you give people a notebook, and if that notebook, you share it and it's incorrect, and it happens, then, for example, I don't know, somebody declared a variable on top and then they redeclared it, or they declared one and then they execute it. So it's a little bit different between, let's say, JavaScript and Python. By default, in JavaScript, is going to re-execute it every time, and then you're sure to get the same result. If it's Python, the notebook, the Jupyter, typically is going to save the result. So it's more like a static text. And then you can have some incoherence, like as you mentioned. But in my opinion, it's more like a methodology problem. Like the person didn't do a good job saving it correctly in a proper, let's say, repeatable state. Theoretically, and it's funny that you mentioned it, because I was just reading an article yesterday about archaeology of notebooks, something like this, of computational notebooks, where people person did a study on basically the quality of notebooks, like you rerun them, and if not, can you search for provenance? Can you find how they were? Is it like a jump between executing this cell and then not the next, but the one after this, or re-executing one cell multiple times? So I think it's people who want to use a notebook and modify it need to be aware of the how do you say at least the execution order. Is it reactive, like I showed, where you change something, everything else that is related will change in consequence, or is it sequential? And then you might get a bit confused. So it depends on the run or the model, let's say, of execution. It also, just to address this any bit, so in a context, is in, and as Brendel mentioned, in machine learning or in AI, Python is usually the de facto standard, and notebooks. So like when you read a current paper in machine learning or AI, you'll usually have a Python notebook with it. If not, the paper might be the notebook. In some journals specifically, they also do this. They don't use necessarily Jupyter, but they do Computational Notebook as the paper. Like you don't have the PDF anymore. There are a couple of journals like this. Like I say, literally couple, or maybe not more than 2, but there are some that do the publication this way. And that means also, if you do it right, reproducibility, which in terms of scientific experiments is either a challenge or, yeah, not the case. So yeah, that's a pretty important point. Helping to do reproducible research.
Well, I can see why it would be of advantage when you're dealing with numbers as the main representation. It's a little harder for me to see why, except in the example you showed with the audio, that conceivably I could move around different representations and compare them quickly. That I can see. So, you know, that's my takeaway. I'd be interested if Frode would talk about how this, you know, how compare this with just an ordinary or non-ordinary text processing software like Word or the one that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really compare that because they are applications on your system. They're not hosted on the web, so you don't have access to the same kind of data. But in terms of usage, a very basic thing would be if you have an article on the current state of the real estate market in your area, instead of only putting down some finished numbers, you can show a bit of how those numbers were generated. So you can then say, I don't agree with this one assertion that there are too many people moving into town or whatever it might be. So you can put a slider for that thing. That can then also be used for policy. I could imagine articles on immigration, where you can balance different places, different things, different aspects. Same thing, military, like right now, how much support can America and the UK give Ukraine? What things make a difference? Not everything comes down to numbers, of course, but there are many things that can, and you of course have access to APIs, so you can have an article on like right here in England, we're going through a bit of a drought at the moment. How long is that expected to last, and how much water will then be needed to make up for it? But you know, there are so many things, and I don't feel literate enough in this yet, because I still think this is mostly for people who can at least do basic programming. And of course, that's an interesting challenge, but that almost goes for Excel as well. You know, we can all do basic things in Excel, but not that much. So it's just another tool to make the data interactive. And it doesn't just have to be numbers. It can be names and other variables too, which is interesting. Mark, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of arrive at listening to Bob's comment about, you know, watch on through is another aspect where I think it can be useful is that, and this isn't necessarily down to measure intelligence, but, you know, some people gain more traction from seeing something actually sort of moving and visualized in front of them. So you can read them, you could give them the argument written in text, or you could have something where you move the slider and this small thing, became many more things or became a much bigger thing. And that has a more, sorry about the dogs barking off, has a more immediate resonance. So in terms of reach and, and sort of, inclusivity is the wrong word, but in terms of being able to speak to a wider audience, I also think it's quite interesting because it allows you to perhaps have greater clarity to people who aren't so used to reading, a tightly written argument in prose terms.
Thank you.
I'll give also a clarification that you don't have to be a programmer to play with the notebook. Like you can receive one, somebody send you one, and you can just click around. So it depends also if you wanna consume it, let's say, or learn about a topic, or do you wanna share your own expertise? So it's quite different. Of course, it's way more involving to create your notebooks. But if you just want to learn, I think that's pretty powerful. And one example that maybe it's just me, but when I finish reading a book, I'm like, oh, I get it. And then that's it. If I can move on and actually not know I have the feeling of knowing about it, but not know. Poking around, the idea is that just like if you take how do you say, a book when you go to a class and you have a bunch of annoying exercises. And those exercises are annoying because they challenge what you think you know, and you might not. So it's a little bit like you can also think of embedding exercises within the text itself. So there are like understandability checkpoints. And if you don't get it, you don't get it. And it makes also, let's say, reading this kind of notebook way more challenging. You can't just scroll through and then somebody calls or there is music and your mind wanders. That's just not going to work. So it's harder to go through and harder to build. But hopefully with the benefit of when you do it, you do get it. And otherwise, yeah, you're going to play with unknowns and like a book have the feeling that now you do have it or not.
I mean, when we talk about the notion of computational notebooks, it can mean a whole lot of stuff. Vint calls it computational text, and Doug Engelbart just called it his journal. One of the things that we did that was quite fun many years ago, Doug and me, because I had a fancy new laptop and he was still using his NLS system from the 70s. So we agreed on a challenge and we said, okay, let's look up the phone number of a mutual friend. And he had it before he even broke eye contact with me. Because for me, I had to find my contacts, open it, find the search dialog, type in the name, double click on it and view it. All he did was to type in, open the document called contacts, scroll down to the line that begins with this text. So he could issue a command from outside the document to be done inside the document. And of course, visual meta as well allows for some interactions like folding a document and stuff. It doesn't really allow for scripting. It's not like I can send a document to Mark and say, look, when this opens, it should open on page 23, folded with this text highlighted. But I think we're all talking about different levels of document interactability. Bob?
I just wanted to note to Fabian that I appreciated the presentation because it showed the structure of what you were going to be saying, and you could go back to it, and so I could understand where you were in your presentation. Is that something that is the ability to let's say it looked like as much of an outline as was necessary? Is that something that's required or just offered in these notebooks?
So this was a little bit a hybrid and some stuff that I've never done before, which that's one of the value again I appreciate from this group, in the sense that usually the Computational Notebook is a link you do at home. And here I was showing it and then sharing a link to embedding it in a presentation. And I don't think that's very common, like I haven't seen it done before. So that was a little bit special. So it's definitely not a requirement. You organize it however you want, which also can be a little bit frightening at first. Yeah, you start with a blank page, but with the ability to move cells around, blocks around, at some point the structure you feel comfortable with should emerge. So yeah, that's up to us. And also just that gives me also sorry, I see a couple of hands up, but that gives me an excuse to clarify that this was one implementation, and I think there are one of the things that I'm tinkering with is doing notebooks, computational notebooks in VR, where you can grab the lines of text or code and move them around. So this was one implementation on one platform, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, maybe even hundreds of ways to do it, and it's also not the final form. Like there are a lot of ways to challenge it. So you can imagine also having on the side the table of content. As you scroll, the table of content on the side stays there. It's up to us basically to define it.
I'm dropping in a link in the chat to the Fennel programming language. And that's the language that was built on top of Lua. And if you scroll down about one screen height, you'll see a very interesting interactive tutorial notebook. Now, one of the neat things there is if you misenter the example of print hello world and you leave out the explanation point, see what happens. So that's a very interesting interaction. Also, it features a side-by-side view of the compiled Lua code generated from the language. So if you click the little button for compiled Lua code, so the toggle Lua code button down the bottom right corner, that will show you the live result of having compiled whatever it was you just typed in. But it's very interesting. I like how the environment is anticipating possible mistakes that you might make and modifying its response as a result. I'm not quite sure how they did that under the hood, but it's absolutely fascinating. And that just sort of fits into the whole computational notebook model very nicely.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit what I meant with understandability checkpoints before. Like, unlike a book, you have the occasion to prompt where the user is. And if it's not where you think they should be, then you should try to narrow, let's say, the landscape of possibilities. And it's entirely dynamic and up to the person designing let's say the notebook. So for example, if you put a range of values and the person puts some value that is, I don't know, illogical, doesn't make sense or whatnot, and you're confident of this, then you can send little hints or narrow this up to a point where it's, let's say, faster to converge toward the answer you expect.
So there's very much a whole art of rhetoric in using computational notebooks that has to be developed.
Brandel?
Yeah, I'm curious about, you're sort of talking about, or trying to sort of feel out the margins of its applicability. When you're, can you think of a place where it's not relevant, and can we think of how it might be or might be made to be in the future?
Not offhand, not relevant. That's a very hard question. Maybe one of the harder questions I've ever been asked, probably. What interests me is whether something like this, that is putting computation in. I've usually thought of, I have a number of large murals about China, which we did 15 years ago, that attempted to summarize all of the economics, the domestic politics, and the foreign relations of China, with some, well, I would guess, now I'm guessing probably 600 data points presented graphically on several large murals, imagining that they would be in a room and could be displayed on screens, and of course the question comes up for each one of those 600 data points: could they be updated with code? And that's the interesting thing to me, because I think that teams need 600 data points to think about China, to even begin to think about China, and what to do. And they certainly need updated data today, because the data that are on my graphs, on my murals, is now 15 years out of date. Some of it would be pretty relevant. The generalizations made from the data would probably, many of them would be fairly similar, particularly in the economics one, because they were made, that China was increasing its economy at a certain rate, and it has been doing that in the last 15 years. So, but anyway, it would, I can imagine having some sort of computational murals, let's say, which intrigue me a great deal, because I think decision makers need that.
Yeah, because at first when we were talking about it, and I was thinking, well, this is all mostly relevant for numerical or otherwise quantified and quantifiable data. But the reality is that most of the meaningful observations that we're going to make in a prose document are about quantifiable data. I think the challenge is how willing are we to make sure that our sort of high-level observations about that data is tied to the sort of the actual live modifiability of that data. So one example that I didn't turn into an observable, but thought a lot about at the time was I built a viewer for data about visitors to apple.com and the size of their screens and the things that they did. And you get somewhere on the order of 1 billion visitors a month. So you need to talk about it in pretty broad strokes. And so I was looking at the sort of the histograms of distributions of pixel widths and things like that. And something that I found really useful was being able to sort of divine certain tendencies and patterns in those lines, whether they were linear or whether they were jagged, indicated whether there were specific devices people were visiting on. And so I knew what to look for in that data, and if I saw those things, then I could say certain things about a web page. That if the lines were sharp here, then that would mean that the visitors were dominated by a group in that sort of that bucket. And so that observation would be useful, but it would be necessary for if I were to turn it into an observable where that prose observation would be present or not, then I would need to tie it to the identification of that specific sort of artifact within the data. And so I think it would require a somewhat more tenacity on the part of the person who was looking at that data and being able to tie those things to it in order to make sure that that commentary, the prose commentary, could be updated in a manner that's appropriate to the data as it changes. And so you would need to be able to imagine not just the data as it exists right now, but also how it could change in the future, or look through a range of different sets.
Yes. Yep. Well, I in the China murals, I insisted that the people who were helping me make it translate all of them into histograms insofar as possible, so that we could then, you know, do the next step that you're talking about, although we didn't get funded for that aspect of it. But there are artificial intelligence things that are come close to that already. They can, you know, looking at particular data, they can say that the data is moving exponentially, or it's moving in some sort of rate, and write a sentence that makes a generalization from that. And I think that can be done.
One thing that I learned from gameplay yesterday that was kind of interesting and relevant to this, because there's so much programming talk at the moment, is on my rifle, I had normal fire mode. I could also turn it into single shot mode. That's kind of a common thing. I also had an under barrel where I can choose to have little grenades coming out. In addition to that, on the fly, I could click another button to choose what kind of grenades are available to me in the barrel. I could choose what kind of ammunition, what kind of scope. These are the normal, fun, modern level of interactions. But what really became interesting is, just like I'm okay with keyboard shortcuts, it's kind of easy after a while to get, even for me, for my own software, the wrong keyboard shortcut sometimes. So one thing I think we really need to look at here, and this is going very much back into our VR territory, that is the notion of direct manipulation. I think it was Ben Schneiderman's term, where, you know, normally you just put this over here. You don't have to write code saying this box on the screen here. I mean, you remember Blade Runner, zoom in 230 by H, and then click to the left. I mean, some people like me don't think like that. I want to move in, move the thing to the side and get it done. That's the same thing when I'm overwhelmed playing with my new fun things on the console, right? So when it comes to these documents, my design perspective has always been to make it feel like the document is a sculpture. That's why we have the folding mechanic, because that's kind of an easy one. But I do acknowledge that treating it like a sculpture is really suboptimal for interactions. So I'm just wondering if there are thoughts on building environments where, especially in a VR space, simply because you have more space, where almost like visual programming, you have things you can kind of put in, because someone like me is not going to go through. I'm basically dyslexic when it comes to this stuff. How many types of brackets do we need to say hello? Right? I don't understand why there isn't an IDE developed at this point that can actually understand and do that automatically. You know, I would think it's almost like, to me, being a bit defensive now, that programming environments are written for programmers, right? Which of course they are, they have to be. But couldn't there be some things to help us? I mean, one of the things that is such a huge overhead when you start writing something, you know, maybe this is the functional code, and then you have to have this much stuff to load libraries, and you have to type them out. It's really fascinating. But I think even on this call, we can see the difference in mindsets between those who feel that that's possible and some people want to just build sandcastles. That was my little rant. Mark?
Right. I was just going to thinking back to this thing about having, you know, lots of interactions and the idea actually sort of, as listening to Bob talk about all the China things. I'm just reminded though of one yet another reason for caution, sort of which loops back to I think the point I think it was Peter raised about, you know, when if you have your notebook gets sort of stuck out of whack because it reuses something, and this was very early automated combat systems. I pointed out which is, yet another place I didn't get asked back to. No, but I pointed out, well, they made it so everything could be configured individually. And yet when you were doing certain tasks, you absolutely did not want your scribble that you'd done, where you'd played with something, to be left where it needed to fly back almost, because at moments of critical choice, you needed the system to be sort of reset. And there's a lesson that stayed with me. So, and it's a bit like actually going around one of those museum exhibits where anyone can play with something. So unless you're the first person of the day, you get some weird, rather hard to understand interface where someone's, dialed everything up to 11, and it doesn't kind of make sense in the way that the design originally intended. There's no fault here. I mean, I just sort of echo this as a warning to self that. So in terms of if we use these things, these are yet more things that the author, for want of a better word, is going to have to take ownership of, because it's not something we can just punt down the line and assume somebody else will do it.
No, hang on. What do you mean take ownership of?
So if I'm making a computational notebook, or I'm maybe making a Bob Starr mural with lots of interactivity in it, that I need to accept it's my responsibility to just actually turn all the knobs at once and see just how confusing it gets, because that's going to be what people will experience. And so I shouldn't just assume that it's somebody else's task for that to be done. That's something that if I'm building it myself, have to do, or if it's a group project that somebody within the project has to do. It's a bit like, just to finish, to link that to the current world. It's like the number of people who write documentation and never get it read by someone who wasn't on the design team, which is the epic fail of fails.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly where to come, and I see your hand, but just in terms of that, there are so many ways this can be done. I mean, one thing that I have always wanted for visual meta from the very, very first day is that if you highlight something in the text in the normal document, and then you do a control click or whatever it might be and say, this is a variable, and then you get a little like pop-up thing where you can set this stuff. When it then exports, it can export looking with the default variable. That's all that's in the PDF. But the visual meta knows which bits are supposed to be interactive. It has whatever equation is needed written in plain English at the back. So the reader software then can choose to render those clickable, so to speak. So I understand, Mark, that basically the author would produce software the way it is now. And if the software starts being supported, we're back in the same thing we've had with Flash and all kinds of things. I absolutely agree. So we got to look at other solutions. But I have to say, I'm not exactly an optimist for that at the moment. Sorry, Fabienne, please, over to you.
Yeah, so even though Bob is gone, I'll still share my screen for two things. The first, yes, I was, first is this. So I've done another notebook for something a bit unrelated, but I play at the moment with some electronics and capacitive, so that you basically can interact with your computer, with a banana, with a Play-Doh, with your own body, someone else's body, whatever, because it's fun. It changes a bit from the keyboard. And I wanted to show the result. So that looks a bit like a makey. So I'll just show what it looks like for real, let's say. So it's looked like this. But I wanted to integrate it potentially with everything. So it looks like something a bit crazy. But in practice, the computer believes it's a keyboard. It's detected as a keyboard and there is no driver needed. So it works with anything. Including VR. So you put it in and then you can play with it. But then what I did here, I did a little, you can see I'm putting the left key or the right key and it shows it. And that's an SVG. I just load the SVG that I did using Inkscape. And then because I annotated correctly, that little part is the virtual LED, as if it was turned on like here on the physical device. And why do I show this? And it's a little bit of a shame that Bob isn't here, is because that's the SVG of my silly little device, but it could be the SVG of anything. So when I mentioned data visualization before, that's true, but it doesn't have to be the only thing. It could be literally any kind of visual. And that means that this becomes an interface for anything. Or we can use an existing interface where we think of a GUI, but manipulating however we want. It could be also, of course, yeah, all those shortcuts, but it could be a data point based on widgets, which bring me to the other point I wanted to show is I just showed the sliders, but there are hundreds of different widgets. And that's to your point, Freud, that it's not just for programmer. If you build it, yes, it is for programmer. I think it's really hard to build one without the key concept. I mean, if you wanted to make it truly interactive, but there are like countless ones like this, and you can move both. There are, I just show sliders, but there are a lot of, let's say, interactivity. There are countless of them. And of course, you can design your own the same way that I showed the SVG here. I could click on this contact instead, and it would turn on the LED, for example, if I wanted. So this doesn't have to be the way to interact. This is optional. The first way is, let's say, natural, and still changing everything text-based. And so, yeah, lots of different ways to interact. And one that also I find it helpful for people that come from Excel or spreadsheets is what they call the Data Wrangler. And it basically looks a bit like the spreadsheet you are familiar with. But then you can, for example, here, I can sort, so I can drag and drop. So let me see. Maybe I missed it. Otherwise, I'll just order by. So this is drag and drop. You need to care about the data, let's say, but nothing more. Maybe I did wrong. Order by. I need to click. Sorry. And then I order by. I wanted to see attendees and descending. So here I'm manipulating the data, but visually. And after, if I want to go deeper, then I can copy that code and put it somewhere else. So there are a lot of different ways. There are also diagrams. You can define some diagrams and you can make them interactive. You don't need to touch the code if you're just consuming the document, or if you want to make it this way, that's also possible. So you can definitely imagine designing some visual computational notebook without either any code or too much code, but you still need to get some, let's say, the concept, or at least, let's say, the execution order or things like this. So. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, that looks quite interesting, but there is it's like different fields need to have hazing rituals to keep people out. Like in finance, there's a lot of terms that sound really fancy and mean very, very little. And I do feel myself, back in the day, HTML was accessible, right? We could do a lot, even ordinary people like me, because it was quite simple. But there seems to be a lot of supposedly helpful coloring and / lines to say you're going to have a comment. Fair enough. But remember GoLive before Adobe bought it? GoLive was absolutely phenomenal. It was a very visual platform for doing all kinds of stuff, especially image maps. Image maps were really fantastically powerful when they were possible to make. You would draw a box, you would put a link on it, and that would make something. So if you fiddled around, you could make something really, really powerful. And considering you could put a link to an image map, you could also put in a function, right? So that was really simple and clean. But there is something really upsetting, which is the way the market moves. And I'm not against capitalism in this sense or anything like that. I'm just talking about human nature, where there seem to be different stages of tool development for any new technology, where you get to a point where in the beginning, it's just the experts of that field, as it has to be. And then suddenly someone comes in and solves some problems and vastly broadens who can play in that field. And then after a while, there's a bit of bubbling and it settles to a level of a different kind of experts. Because making web pages now is significantly harder than it was in the 90s, not just with GoLive, but with other tools too. There seems to be...
You can make the same page you could make in the 90s today. It's just that, and in fact, I do. You know,
what tools do you use?
I use Sublime Text or Visual Studio Code, but I write in Notepad essentially. And a lot of people have build systems and compile systems, and I issue all of that every time that I make a sort of a prototype for representing something as though it's LinkedIn or Amazon or Apple.com. I use a plain text editor, and I don't use any build systems, and I don't use anything like that. I often take screenshots of pieces of other people's web pages or text, or copy paste it. But it is I guarantee you as simple as a web page was in the mid 90s, because I was authoring then, and I haven't changed particular aspect.
I'm sure hand-coded pages will still work. Yes, absolutely. But you know, Apple also had a web making part of the iCloud or Me or whatever for a while. It was really elegant. Now you basically have to use Squarespace if you're an individual. There are no other options really. If you use WordPress, the templates are awful. And the level of customization is awful. So you have to talk to an expert like Peter to go in and change the CSS and all of that stuff. So this is not only me having a moan. This is just looking at why does it seem like who the author is changes over the years to what kind of person is expected to be the author. Mark.
Well, having a similar conversation, different area just earlier today, but because I think it's not just visual things. Part of the problem is that that the things we don't understand are obviously easier because they're done by somebody else. So I just want a web page that's easy to do, and I don't want all that code stuff. I just want buttons and things. But someone's got to make the buttons, and computers are dumb. They only know what we tell them. And in the other conversation was in terms of knowledge systems. One of the problems is you know, the one thing people don't want to do is think, and we've been infantilized by WYSIWYG tools to the extent that often people can only think through. Let me finish. They will only think through trying to make something look right, and there's nothing wrong with the look of something, but underneath it, the problem we're dealing with is we sometimes don't even know ourselves really quite what we're trying to do, except by saying it looks right, and this causes us tremendous problems. And so, like Brunel, I mean, I encode HTML because I don't know enough to write all the fancy stuff, so I just write stuff that works. But I'd agree. You know, the trouble is we want the fancy stuff, but we don't want effectively the learning that comes with it. And I get that, and I don't say that as a canard. I mean, it's there for all of us, and I'm not saying I have an answer to it, but I think it's a wider pattern of us wanting richness and assuming that computers, you know, that code just knows what we want to do. Just because I drag something from here to another place may not be as obvious to the receiving object as it was to me doing it. And I think we just see lots of that there. And it's not that we're being stupid and we dragged it in the wrong place. It's just this thing that we sometimes assume that our intent is much more obvious to the receiving person or object than it really is.
Right. Mark, infantilized is a very loaded term. Are you saying that because I can do things at very high speed in Photoshop and Lightroom and Final Cut and Illustrator, then I'm an infant because I don't program?
No, I didn't say that at all. What I said was that because we, for instance, in our most of our writing tools now, you know, the ones you have easy access to, you know, Google Docs or Word or something. What you're actually doing is, instead of writing, you're sort of battling with what it looks like to you know, so in other words, you're not writing, you're dicking around with the styles unintentionally. And indeed, one of the things I've learned to do is I just don't use those tools anymore, or not until, so I sort out the content, and it's separating the content and presentation now.
Yeah, but Mark, you're making a really annoying assumption, and that is that content, when it comes to text, can be separated from presentation. Of course it cannot. There is no such
Yes,
thing.
it
No, it cannot. There's no.
This is the pointless
let me
argument.
finish my sentence. There's no such thing as a non-typeface. There will always be a font. There will always be a typeface. The text will always have a size. It'll always have a weight. It'll always have spacing. You will always have a layout. You can't write without visuals.
I think you're confusing. There's a difference. If you just open up Notepad or what is it, type edit or whatever, text edit, and just start typing. I mean, or text edit in plain text form. You're absolutely right. You're actually writing in a monospace font as it happens. But what you're not doing is you're not worrying about, well, why does this heading 2 not look like that heading 2, or why have some paragraphs got a line break underneath them? And that's the dreck that we wade through with word processors. And that's not what we didn't want that. We sort of know what we want, but the machine doesn't, because it can't know, and we do things like cutting and pasting things we didn't mean to into the place. So that's what I mean. It's much easier to write what you mean to write and then put it into an environment where you can apply the styles. I don't think that runs counter to what you're saying, and I'm certainly not arguing against typefaces, which I love. But I do think our enjoyment of rich visual interfaces, which themselves have to be designed and expensively designed, so that a small change is an engineering cost every time it crops up, which is why you see people
correct.
often. Sorry.
That's not correct. I mean, on the Mac, the way you develop software, you do use visual tools. It's not like you have to program the shape of buttons or anything. So to do visual changes is very inexpensive because of the APIs and the tools that are made available.
Well, I'll let a programmer speak. I will beg to differ, such as what I've been told and when I was commissioning software, what I learned. But you know.
Okay, yeah, Fabian.
Yeah, I don't know how that works, but I think in terms of toolings, yeah, everything it's never going to get easier. It's always going to get more complicated because we build stuff on stuff on stuff on stuff, and we always want more. But I think it's I don't think visual tools necessarily they embed a lot of expertise basically. The problem is, or the challenge is, some of it is way harder to have with self-discovery than if you, let's say, train to get that expertise. So that means quite often, I think that's why we get some, let's say, learning curve that are not linear, that we think we can do a lot with a tool where we don't need to do what is harder to reach because it has either a grammar, a syntax, or maybe have to memorize a lot of terms or whatever, like a harder interface basically. But sometimes then we maybe hit a wall. So if we are to, I'm not saying every time you learn the hardware, you're going to go further, but some of the key concepts, let's say the foundation, I don't know, it's like somebody who would use Blender to do 3D and they don't know what some of, let's say, the primitives, let's say the vertices are, they can only go that far. And even by clicking all around, at some point, you need the concept. And I think no matter the quality of the tool, if they don't, let's say, do some onboarding that give you the core concept behind of how the tool works, then I think you reach a plateau basically.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, you also have to consider the accessibility issue in these interfaces. Text is absolutely wonderful. I had a friend many years back who was a blind programmer, and he was working very effectively until everything moved to visual editor modes, and it basically froze him out of the industry because there wasn't a clear, distinct ability to work independently in a textual representation as opposed to having to work in a visual representation. And using a screen reader to try and describe, even with all the best coding of our ARIA tools and everything else, try to help the screen readers by hinting our user interfaces, the amount of time that it took to navigate the document object model for an editor using a screen reader was so prohibitively time consuming that it utterly destroyed his ability to compete in the market and operate effectively. So even though he could do it, it would take him orders of magnitude more time to interact with it because it had to be going through this textual interface to be talking to a graphical interface as opposed to being able to work in a pure textual mode. So I think we can build tools that are purely textual. And when we do, we need to make sure that we maintain a bidirectional synchronization between visualizations of that code and the pure textual representation of that code. And not necessarily the same affordances on either side, as long as the underlying code that's constructed with the affordances is able to interact on the other side. So on the purely textual side, it might be an interactive textual dialogue where you're typing in natural language, asking questions about the code and getting answers from the system in text. Whereas on the graphical side, you might be navigating an outline and popping through nested structures and hyperlinking them. You still have an underlying model that's going to be shared by the two. But again, the affordances on either side and the representations on the two sides don't need to be the same, as long as there's an interlingua that allows them to remain synchronized.
Yeah, that's been a huge priority for Swift and Swift UI, is to ensure that there's that full bidirectionality for that very reason. And yeah, the rationale for it is not always communicated along with that requirement, but that makes perfect sense, Peter, in terms of the capacity to be able to kind of transport those representations. One of the things that I wanted to talk about or present, if people aren't familiar with, is the alternative to text-driven programming and just how garbage it is. Let me find. So if you've ever looked at hello, small ones, it's nice to see you. If you've ever looked at node-based or not Node as in Node.js, but Node as in node-based programming languages or environments, things like the what is it called in Unreal? Blueprints, Unreal Blueprints. I think that's what they're called. Yeah, I'll share my screen here. They are a place where real sort of technical people live and work. So here it is, share screen. So this is what people end up doing when they are doing visual programming, and it's hard to argue that this is easier to follow than using brackets and parentheses. And this is not a complicated program. The fundamental issue is that sort of the execution of code control inevitably results in complexity of a kind that is very, very challenging to manage. And so a lot of people have attempted, this is just, so, and the thing is that this is the least worst way for a lot of people to navigate functionality within Unreal. This is what is making your games, Coda, what's managing your sort of quick alternate grenade launcher. This is a lot tidier. You know, some people have slightly sort of better capacity to keep these things under control. But you know, I know and work with artists inside Apple who use tools like this. And they write things that are similar. They end up with things that are similarly complex. And it's really the only way to get anything like an application working. I mean, that's very simple. I think it's just a flowchart, I think. What's another one? Shader graphs are similar. And there's no free lunch. The use of typographic marks, like you're saying, denoting parentheses and brackets and braces, angle brackets, those are frustrating. But the alternatives, from my part, the only time that I know people use visual tools like this by preference is when it's actually not possible to use a textual one, or when the visual representation of the intermediaries, as is the case within a shader graph, are so important as to sort of require that particular kind of capacity to be sort of threaded through it. So and it's disappointing for a lot of people that there isn't anything better than this. You know, that's been Alan Kay's attempt with Scratch and Squeaky tools for many decades now, it does genuinely appear as though it gives people a leg up in terms of the initial introduction into programmatic thinking, but I haven't seen particularly ample evidence that it takes people much further than that.
Yeah, I can appreciate the complexity there, but I mean, first of all, I don't have the brain to learn to program. I have tried. And it doesn't take long until it just doesn't work. But I'm just looking at simple things like when you've loaded in the libraries and all of that stuff, why in the world does that need to be on the page all the time? You know, why can't you somehow easily just like, this is the bit I'm working on, or this is the code. But anyway, let's not waste time on this. You know, clearly a much bigger issue, whether it's from Computational Notebook or whatever.
I really think you could learn to code and Frode if you put a little time into it and had an open mind.
I think that is Peter, I respect you, but I think that is an incredibly narrow-minded and arrogant thing to say, because I know what my skills and my attributes are. You know, I'm a creative person. I've taught basically communication at college. People say I have a great eye for photography. You know, people look at my work and say, wow, this is not how other people take pictures. You know, I don't think I would necessarily say to you guys, well, to you, Peter, you know, why don't you just take my Leica for a year, you know, take a couple of 100,000 pictures. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to get a nicely framed shot too. Right? Because in both cases, there are barriers. We both have to put in efforts. I have to put in efforts for my visual work. You have to put in efforts for your programming work. But it's like saying, you're a fantastic author. I'm sure you could do a pop song as well. Or this painting is absolutely amazing. Why don't you do quantum physics? There are very different mentalities. When I was doing my master's, one of the people I studied with, I might have mentioned it, he had to serve in the Israeli Air Force. Not that I in any way condone what those guys are doing. And he was in charge of keeping planes safe from landing and takeoff. There were different people whose job it was to put them into combat. There are different mentalities. There are different ways of doing it. It's not like I could say, you know, my brother is a theater director. He's so great with people. You know, he couldn't program. And, you know, the way he deals with people in a room, none of the six of us, I would guess, speaking for myself, can go into the room and work it like he can. So this whole thing that programming is just spending time and attention is, I don't think you guys know how brilliant you are.
No, I do. But I would still dispute the possibility that you can't program. What you think is programming might differ from what I think is programming. And because if you did HTML in the 90s, you were programming. And there are complexities that you're right, you won't be able to reach. You might not be able to understand tailed recursion. You might not be able to implement, you know, complex algorithms. But the basic capacity for scripting is something that I do genuinely think that anybody who has the ability to bang a couple of keys together has the ability to do, and that it is actually beneficial for them to be able to do so. You're absolutely right that there are ceilings that various people can reach or not. And I've seen that. I have a number of fairly arcane combinations of skills with regard to visual art as well as programming. And when people don't have both of those, then there are places I can show them pretty well and they can't follow. So I'll freely submit that there are those limitations. But I would say your brother is programming. I have a friend who's the chief cybersecurity analyst for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in New Zealand. And when I was talking to his son about what he does, I said, he does the same thing as I do. We both build machines. I build machines out of bytes and bits, but he builds machines out of people and reports, but we're doing the same thing. And he's like, huh, that's true. So yeah, I think that there are things that you could learn, and there are benefits that you could glean from it. And there are languages where you don't have to do that kind of stuff that you're talking about. If you look at something like processing or Sketch, those are simple enough that you get straight into the moment, and there are definite benefits to that. And there are ceilings that it won't allow you to go past. But yeah, like it is, I think, unconstructive to assert that there is absolutely no capacity for computational control that you can wield as a consequence of the difficulty you have in distinguishing those typographic marks.
Mark,
I will concede that I'm guilty of assuming that everyone has an inner Leonardo da Vinci and can dive into any discipline and pick it up, given a little time and motivation.
Well, I mean, time and motivation is one hand, is one thing on one hand, but to veer a little bit off the subject specifically of programming and technically, some people say the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing and expecting a different outcome. It's like, I have to admit, my frustration at the minute is trying to deal with these text things and making an incredibly not headway at all. I mean, I don't know who will be watching this video, but one of them is for the future of text we're supposed to have in September. Let's see if it even happens. But I put to Klaus Atzenbach and to Vint and a few other people, who should we invite from VR, and they suggested people to help with people who are disabled and sound. Where does sound fit? Right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with sound, but it's like I've been banging my head with this stuff for so many years. I'm really considering other career options. It's just not moving forward. So we kind of come into a discussion of, I'm trying to do author, and there are small changes we need to do. I don't think I will be able to get into even changing, font colors in author, which I should be able to do because they, the Apple programming environment, Xcode. But goodness gracious me. Anyway,
on a glass half full note, if I could, so I'm going to change the subject on something that's sort of practical that we're doing that puts us back in text, if I may, if that's all right. Yeah, because I don't want to cut anyone off. So I'll show a screen briefly. So can you see a screen with lots of circles on it? Yeah.
The 2050 mural. Right. Awesome.
Good. Okay, so this is this is what I found misunderstanding a point Jim raised because he was in fact talking about this mural. But I spent some time this week. Well, I did actually get all the text out of this using the wonderful Text Sniper tool because this is a JPEG and not a PDF. But I'm stuck at the same point that I don't know how best you map this back onto either a new document or an existing document. So assuming I had the Adobe Illustrator or PDF of the document I got on screen at the moment, I've got bits of text that relate to boxes. I didn't bother with the diagrams at this point. But the question is, if you've got a vector artwork, there isn't and isn't a native resolution. If it was pixels, it's sort of easier because you can, you definitely can more easily cross-do this. Because I'm thinking it in a more holistic sense. If I was stepping out today to make this document, perhaps it would be sensible if I started with a manifest of all the text I'm going to use. So that when I add a text element, I'm adding the ID of that text element so it can map across to other things. So that, for instance, UI tools agents in VR can, when they click on that, know that it's this text, and it might even be loaded with other interesting stuff like URLs or dereferencing the URLs to give you more information about the subject. I didn't address in looking at this particular document the cases where arrows have a particular meaning and so you find things like, and also in deconstruction. So for instance, this band of 2020s is clearly decorative. This 2010s caption is repeated here. Now, if you're extracting the text, do you really slavishly need to extract both of those or just the one? And so that, so that just the sheer embuggerance of doing the task, which wasn't much fun, but the whole point of doing it was, it really brings these questions to the fore. But anyway, I do have all the text of the thing that's on screen. I just have no way of attaching it to a vector image lying underneath it. And I don't think, I don't have Adobe Illustrator, but as far as I'm aware, its scripting is mainly built for basically production process, unsurprisingly. I don't think it's designed to allow you to do, because I was imagining, well, if you made the documents on screen, or the last one, that it would be good if it could produce, say, a sidecar file that's an SVG overlay that's web consumable, that something like our agent in VR, when it interacts with the picture, could use the SVG as the overlay to work out the click detection points and the it's linked through to any enhancement it wants to make. And I don't know what to do that. The one I've got on screen, I did take the PDF of that, and it's got something like 1,000 layers in it. And by turning off basically most of the images, I was just trying to work out, I still couldn't find a way to basically just easily detect and extract the circles in which the text lives. And then you get into the interesting part. So things like this area here at the top, is that text? Is that text, or is it part of a picture? So is it text that I need to interact with, although it's clearly inside a picture? And I mention this because flopping back to the creative end. So if I'm the designer doing this, I may be just a graphic designer, but I'm going to have to start thinking, if I want to make interactive documents of the type we're thinking of in VR, I or someone in the production chain needs to understand that I might be putting text in a picture, and to me it's just a picture as a graphic artist, but actually it has a semantic meaning when I'm interacting it as an infographic. I can't claim to have any answers on that, but I see a gap. So I see a gap in the tool's ability, because I think Adobe is probably the gold standard here. I don't actually have the Adobe kit at the moment, so someone can set me right on that. But it does seem that what the tools, and whether they're sort of AI or Photoshop, whatever, but I'm not sure the scripting has sort of, someone thought, one of the things we now need to be able to do is to basically map elements in the picture to a data layer, because I think it's something we need to do. And it's something that I think certainly here we could possibly make some sensible suggestions on, because, and in this case, I think SVG might be the way to go, because I've very much internalized Brandl's point that, a web-based thing is probably the way to go to bridge this gap. And correct me if I'm wrong, then SVG probably is, for today, the encoding to use. So now I've got to get a vector document, some elements of a vector document mapped onto SVG shapes that I can then use as click targets.
And that's where the ideally authoring within Illustrator or and some other vector tool has the ability for you to build the appropriate sort of hierarchical containment. And that also allows you to name groups and provide other sort of sidecar information, either implicitly through the form of the layer names and things like that. That's a popular choice, or explicitly in the form of maybe non-renderable objects that are contained within those things as well. So those are the two options. I mean, go ahead.
No, because it's interesting too. So in deconstructing the one with the big circles that I had up on screen just now, well, I had a PDF that I was using Affinity Designer, which is like a cheap kind of Illustrator. But it was really interesting that the layers didn't seem to in any way, shape, or form conform to the visual structure. So you'd have and two pictures in one group that belong to different visual elements, and that's not me. That's not me. You know, back talking the designer. It's not my job to tell them how to do it. But if you want to have informational documents that actually can link through things, you can't do that. You're going to have to relearn some styles. So you're not making a static document anymore. That once it's a PDF or a poster on the side of the bus, it's done. That's not acceptable anymore for some classes of documents.
Yeah, and in practice, that's that's a thing that everybody within these sort of technical visual fields has to learn at some point or other. Where there is a very strict house style for the presentation and construction of 2D and 3D documents at Apple in our marketing and communications department. How we name layers, how we can nest and contain them. There are you may notice that we have like screenshots of things like calendar and stuff like that. And all of those are live nested PSD Photoshop documents that you click through a strict specific number of times in order to be able to get to the source document where you can change the date on it in case we want to make sure that it's the date, because I think it's typically the date of the launch. And so if that ever moves, then we need to make those change. Or if there are particular kind of hot locations that you want to be able to cite, then those are different per country actually. And so the people who are responsible for business analysis have to be able to get through and dump the data into the right place. And so all of those things become places where things need to be not just visually conformant insofar as they look right, but also technically conformant. And there are ways of doing that in Illustrator. It's unreasonable to expect, as you point out when you're saying it's not a bag on the person responsible for the illustration, is that there's no reason for anybody to expect that a schema is conformant to a specific expectation ahead of time. And that's kind of the rub with all of the data stuff, is that you can't impose a schema post hoc on these things and expect it to function, and that applies in a computational context as much as in a visual technical one there. So, but what you're saying, I think SVG is right. I think that if it's possible for Bob to work in the AI document to compose and structure it in those ways, then that's probably also the cheapest thing to do, and we'd get a long way from being able to kind of think about what specific uses we want to get out of it, and being able to structure the technical hierarchy of the document along those lines in ways that won't have any particular risk of changing any visual artifacts or representation as it actually exists on the page.
Yeah, because so I thought
that's good. It just means that it is work.
Yeah, I thought the 2010 vision thing that didn't have too many elements on board was slightly more tractable in terms of volume, because I was thinking the next step is even if I just have to trace the damn things, is to make an SVG layer just to get to the point where the likes of yourself can then go and do exciting things with it. But the text is useless without this glue to map it to effectively the static visual substrate that's underneath it. So we can take this PDF, JPEG, whatever, we can show it in a VR space.
Yeah.
But to be able to step through to do all the funky things we can imagine.
What it means.
Yeah, we've definitely got to have this linkage. And so that was a Damascene moment I had this week of saying, okay, well, unless we fix that, in a sense, it's all for naught. We can mock up each end of it, but at some point it's got to link together. And it would seem that, and so there are two tasks. One is to say, what is it reasonable to do with effectively the large amount of legacy material we have, because we've got lots of it, as opposed to what we may do with a digitally born native tomorrow document built in a tool that's has a thought of this. And one other edge case I'll throw in is, of course, if you have this document, you have your text, and the graphic designer rightly, points out that this text will not fit into that box. You can have this design or you can have this text, but you can't have both. So something gives and the text gets changed. So you also now need a way to ripple that through, either that you record in the SVG layer that the text you see in the visual representation is not in a sense, the actual text represented. I mean, I don't know the answers, but it's yet another interesting aspect of metadata that's all got to be taken on board by somebody and codified by somebody.
Yeah. I just with the last few minutes, I want to address what Frode said about not making any progress. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I kind of, you all know that is my fault. I introduced everybody in this space. I mean, I didn't introduce Fabian to VR, but I introduced Fabian to this space for the reason of the promise of VR. But the reality is that it is an exceptionally difficult environment to make any headway and progress in right now. The Oculus Quest was the absolute first viable sort of product to have any of these conversations being even imaginable, let alone practical to make any progress on. If Fabian will back me up here, like the HTC Vive is not something that would have enthused any of you in terms of its capabilities, but it itself was transformative to the point where it was the first time in 20 years prior to that I believed that any of these things were even remotely possible to embark upon. But the Quest and the Quest 2 are still deeply limited in terms of the context that they lay bare and make available. The Quest 3 Pro that should be coming out this year will help a lot, but we are absolutely out on our own in this discipline, thinking about what text and virtual reality and the way those things kind of fit together. The reason why the progress is slow is because no one else is here yet, and they'll come. They'll come in the next couple of years, and the benefits that you have gleaned as a consequence of doing the thinking that you've done this year are going to be legion at that point. But it's whenever you're working with an emerging technology, there are times when it just isn't working yet. Larry Tesler, the fellow who was head of advanced technology at Apple for a number of years, a number of decades, but was at Xerox PARC and everything like that. His initial sort of interest was in artificial intelligence, but then he sort of took a look at the state of the art in the mid-70s and said, well, that's going to be 25 years until it's interesting, and just gave it up. It was his first love, and he said goodbye to it because it wasn't going to work over that time period. Virtual reality was like that from the mid-90s until the mid-teens. And just because it's off ice again, doesn't mean that it's ready for people to be able to make, and I don't mean to say it pejoratively, easy progress. It's so hard. It's still so hard. And so everything that you've been doing, everything that we're doing in this group, Rhoda, is incredible, world-changing, but the world's not ready to notice yet.
Well, Randall, it's an interesting perspective, but I am talking about the whole text work in general. It's getting a little bit soul destroying. Just trying to organize a venue for this symposium is becoming just very unpleasant. I hope the RSA would be there because Vint Cerf would be there and so on. They have taken, a month to get back to me. So we've lost another place. And in terms of the actual dialogue that's going on in the community, there is very, very little. We worked on doing the journal. No one has actually read anything. I think Bob Horn skipped through one issue where he liked some of the bold bits, which is absolutely fair enough. And, when it comes to the production of richer material, what Fabian has done that he showed today in terms of the record is useful stuff. But in terms of moving the needle, I've been doing this for 12 years now, plus author, and it's just not getting any traction. So it is not just the VR, it is the whole package. And it's just, it's just not functioning. So I'll have to make some decisions.
I understand.
Yeah, it's time to stop going crazy.
yeah, you need to do what you need to do. But I appreciate the focus specifically on text and hypertext that you've been able to give, and the sort of the tentpole of a community you're able to rally toward it, because I think that there are incredible opportunities, and I think that we have in the next few years the opportunity to really genuinely make good on some of them. So I'm sorry to hear that it is as challenging as it is. I know from experience organizing. I had a game developers club, and I did dozens of presentations on various programming and visual techniques within the Apple organizations around over the years, and they all feel like they come to nothing. But the impressions that they leave on people are kind of are slow burns, but important in terms of the impact they have on their people's thinking and career. So yeah, if it has to end, it has to end. But I'm grateful for what you've been able to do so far.
Frode, I'd like to second feedback that Brendel has given you. I've been listening to only 2 or 3 weeks plus, but my reaction is that something big is going to happen in the future because of these discussions. And I think the work you've done, as I observed it for the first time without even going into depth yet, has been very, very valuable. So obviously, and I think Brandel's right, you've got to make your own decisions, but I've been very, very impressed. So more power to you for sticking with so long. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what can be possible. All right, we're 1 minute over. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.